Neuroscience. It's not the intensity of one session that matters most. It's the rhythm over weeks and months that leads to durable, high-fidelity encoding. Even fatigue, which is often seen as a barrier, becomes adaptive in the context of consistency. When you train through manageable levels of fatigue, your system learns how to perform under constraint. The brain begins to automate tasks that were once effortful. This automation frees up cognitive bandwidth, allowing you to perform more skillfully with less conscious effort. What felt like a grind becomes flow, not by accident, but by design. Visualization has become a widely promoted tool in the world of personal development, performance, and mindset training. Athletes, entrepreneurs, and creatives are often encouraged to see their goals, to imagine the outcome vividly, to picture the moment of victory. While this has some value, especially in priming the nervous system for confidence, the science tells a more precise and more demanding story. If you want to truly leverage the brain's capacity for change, you cannot just visualize the win. You must simulate the effort. You must feel the struggle. The brain is a prediction machine. It uses memory, sensory input, and imagines scenarios to forecast what's likely to happen and prepare the body accordingly. When you vividly imagine an experience, your brain activates many of the same neural circuits that would be used during the real event. This is why mental rehearsal can improve performance. It sets the stage. But here's the problem. If your visualization only includes the end state, crossing the finish line, winning the award, receiving the praise, you're missing the most important part of the learning process. You're wiring in a fantasy, not a plan. What drives neuroplastic change, what literally reshapes your brain's circuitry, is emotionally charged, attention-rich repetition. Visualization that involves only the dopamine-rich peak moment of success can actually backfire. It gives the brain a false sense of completion. It simulates the reward without the work. Over time, this can blunt motivation because the nervous system has already felt the outcome, and the contrast with the real-world effort can feel disheartening. The reward has been predicted, but not earned. In contrast, when you simulate the struggle, the early mornings, the resistance, the fatigue, the failures, the self-doubt, you activate a far more adaptive system. You engage the insula, a region of the brain involved in interoception, internal body sensing, and the anterior cingulate cortex, which monitors conflict and effort. These areas are critical for building grit because they prepare you for the emotional and physical signals that arise during real-world challenges. You are not just visualizing an ideal, you are rehearsing resilience. This kind of stress-inclusive visualization has been studied in elite military training, competitive sports, and high-stakes creative work. When individuals mentally rehearse obstacles along the path, missed attempts, distractions, inner resistance, and see themselves navigating those obstacles effectively, the nervous system responds differently. It becomes less reactive, more regulated. You don't just hope you'll handle adversity, you've trained for it. Another key factor is the somatic component. It's not enough to picture the scene. You must embody the experience. Feel the breath quicken, the hands tighten, the muscles fatigue. This level of sensory detail signals to your brain that this is not entertainment. This is preparation. The amygdala, which tracks emotional salience, and the hippocampus, which encodes memory, both increase their activity when internal imagery is paired with visceral sensation. This deepens the plasticity window. The learning sticks. Importantly, simulating struggle doesn't make the process more negative. It makes it more realistic. It calibrates your expectations. The more accurately your brain models the effort required, the more fluidly it can shift from thought into action when friction arises. This minimizes the psychological shock of challenge. You're not caught off guard by difficulty, you've rehearsed it. You've predicted the pain, and you've built the circuitry to move forward anyway. This approach also taps into the dopamine reward system, more effectively. Dopamine is not just released in response to reward, it's released in anticipation of reward when effort is perceived as meaningful. If your visualization includes struggle and your nervous system sees that struggle leading somewhere worthwhile, dopamine rises during the effort. You build motivation not from fantasy, but from conviction that you are doing what's necessary to earn the outcome. There's a concept in neuroscience known as effort-based learning, the idea that the brain values outcomes that follow sustained effort more than those that come easily. When you visualize the sweat, the tension, the repetition, and pair it with the clarity of why you're doing it, you are reinforcing a neural pattern that says this is worth it. You are literally teaching your brain to embrace discomfort as part of the process, not a signal to stop. This reframing has wide-ranging effects on performance and mental toughness. You no longer associate struggle with failure, you associate it with progress. You begin to identify as someone who shows up, who endures, who adapts. That identity, reinforced through neural rehearsal and action, becomes a self-fulfilling model for sustained growth. The win is no longer the point of visualization. It's the byproduct of becoming the kind of person who can endure what the path demands. Identity is often spoken about as a fixed concept, who you are, shaped by your past, your personality, your culture, and your beliefs. But at the biological level, identity is not fixed. It is the product of a living, breathing, electrochemical process. The way you see yourself, your sense of what's possible, your limits, your confidence, your fears. These are not just philosophical abstractions. They are actively constructed and reconstructed by your neurochemical state. And more importantly, that state is highly modifiable. The circuits that govern identity span multiple areas of the brain. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for decision-making, impulse control, and planning, holds much of your narrative identity, how you think about yourself in the context of goals, time, and relationships. The amygdala plays a key role in how you assign emotional salience to those thoughts, while the hippocampus brings in autobiographical memory to shape context. But none of these areas operate in isolation. They are modulated constantly by neurochemicals like dopamine, serotonin, acetylcholine, cortisol, and norepinephrine, each of which shifts how you perceive yourself and your capacity to act. When you're in a high dopamine state, you tend to view yourself as capable. You feel possibility, forward momentum, drive. When dopamine is low, that same task, the same version of you may feel incapable or stuck. Serotonin levels influence how safe or threatened you feel socially. Cortisol, a stress hormone, can temporarily alter self-perception by narrowing focus on risk and heightening negative feedback. In other words, your identity is state dependent. It changes based on the chemical and physiological conditions of your brain and body. This is a fundamental shift in how we should think about self-development. You are not building character in the abstract. You are training circuits. You are reinforcing certain self-presentations through repeated emotional and behavioral patterns, and those representations are stabilized or destabilized by neurochemical signals. Each time you choose to act in alignment with a new identity, especially under tension, you send a strong signal to your nervous system. This is who I am now. Neuroscientific research shows that identity is a kind of predictive model. Your brain is constantly using past experiences to forecast future behavior. But those forecasts are malleable. They can be reweighted by new data, especially when that data includes emotionally significant actions. When you voluntarily expose yourself to discomfort and succeed, even minimally, you begin to alter the model. The brain updates its prediction. You are someone who handles challenge. That's not just a belief, that's a rewiring. Consider the role of deliberate practice. When you engage in repeated behaviors with high attention and emotional intensity, whether it's learning a skill, facing a fear, or establishing a new habit, You are laying down new myelinated pathways. This process requires energy, focus, and time. But once those circuits are formed, they become part of your default. You don't just behave differently, you feel different. You perceive challenge, risk, and opportunity through a new filter. You've shifted your baseline. Breath work, posture, eye position, and physical movement are not cosmetic behaviors. They feed directly into the brain's state regulation systems. Upright posture and a forward gaze, for example, influence the brainstem centers that regulate arousal and orientation. When you adopt these positions intentionally, you upregulate circuits that support approach behaviors. You feel more alert, more engaged, more assertive, and this physical state creates a loop. Your perception of yourself shifts in response to your physiology. Identity is also influenced heavily by internal language, the words you use to narrate your experience. When you consistently tell yourself, "I can't focus," or "I'm not disciplined," you are reinforcing specific patterns of neural activation. These statements, even when said silently, create associations that shape your emotional state and your likelihood to act. But when you choose language like, "I am becoming more focused," or "I'm training discipline today," you cue the brain to treat identity as process, not permanence. This matters because the nervous system is constantly trying to conserve energy. It looks for shortcuts. If your brain believes a certain behavior is not like you, it will subtly sabotage your efforts to change. It will try to keep you in familiar territory, even if that territory is limiting. But when you intentionally create experiences that contradict your old model, especially when paired with new behaviors and reinforced by somatic state, you begin to reprogram the identity map. The familiar shifts, the baseline moves. What emerges is not a fictional or aspirational identity, but a neurobiologically supported self-concept, one that's rooted in action, repetition, and regulation. Identity becomes less about what you believe and more about what you do repeatedly under pressure. The system changes. The chemistry changes, the circuitry adapts. And in that adaptation, the story of who you are begins to change from the inside out. There's a psychological threshold every high-performing human must eventually cross. The realization that no one is coming to save you. No mentor, no boss, no friend, no parent, no institution is going to do the uncomfortable, day in, day out work required to build your life for you. This idea can seem harsh on the surface. It may even feel overwhelming. But biologically and behaviorally, this is one of the most liberating and empowering realizations you can arrive at, because it initiates a shift from dependency circuits to agency circuits in the brain. The default mode for the human nervous system, especially in early development, is reliance. Infants, children, even adolescents depend on external regulation, comfort, structure, and feedback from caregivers and environment. This is appropriate for survival. But as the brain matures, especially the prefrontal cortex, the structure responsible for long-term planning, inhibition, and self-direction, it becomes not only possible but necessary to transition into internal regulation. When you accept at a neurological and behavioral level that no one is coming, you begin to shift from a reactive orientation to a proactive one. This shift activates the anterior mid-cingulate cortex, a region of the brain associated with goal-directed effort in the face of adversity. It also engages the dopaminergic system, but not the kind driven by external validation. This is a self-initiated dopamine circuit, one rooted in volitional action rather than passive reward. It's the difference between waiting for a push and learning how to pull. The belief that someone else might rescue you can be comforting in the short term. It reduces cognitive load and emotional burden. But the cost of that belief is significant. It delays the initiation of hard behaviors. It diffuses responsibility. And perhaps most importantly, it prevents the engagement of adaptation systems in your brain systems that are only activated through self-directed struggle. When you act on your own behalf, not because you were told, not because you were praised, but because you decided, the brain begins to organize itself differently. The locus ceruleus, which regulates attention and arousal via norepinephrine, becomes more finely tuned to your decisions. It sharpens focus around what you've chosen to value rather than what's been assigned to you. You stop looking outward for instruction. You start calibrating internally for direction. From a neuroplasticity standpoint, repeated self-instigated effort builds stronger, more resilient circuits. The act of deciding, even in small things, rewires the prefrontal thalamic striatal loop that governs habits, routines, and executive function. You're not just choosing a task, you're resculpting your internal operating system. And over time, this builds an identity rooted in sovereignty rather than dependent. The phrase, "no one is coming," doesn't mean you won't have support. It means the initiation must come from you. Others may assist, collaborate, encourage, but they cannot create the conditions for your growth. That responsibility lies within the agency centers of your own brain. And those centers become more efficient, more automatic, the more they are engaged. This is what behavioral neuroscientists refer to as self-efficacy, the belief, born of evidence, that your actions influence outcomes. There's a physiological shift that happens when this belief takes hold. Cortisol responses to stress become more regulated, heart rate variability improves, the body no longer perceives challenge as a threat to be avoided, but as a signal to organize energy. The sympathetic nervous system is still activated, but it's under your command. You're choosing to enter discomfort. That choice dramatically reduces psychological threat and increases cognitive control. This also changes the way you interpret failure. When no one is coming, failure stops being a sign that someone else should step in. It becomes data, a feedback mechanism. The brain begins to map not just outcomes, but effort levels, timing, fatigue, and context. You become your own experiment. And with each iteration, the nervous system becomes more precise, more stable, more capable of complex, sustained action. What's remarkable is how quickly the system adapts. Within days or weeks of repeated self-directed effort, whether it's training, writing, studying, building, people begin to report a shift in internal dialogue. The language of can't and should gives way to will and did. This is not just semantics. It reflects a repatterning of neural expectations. The brain is updating its model. You are now the source of initiation. This transition is not smooth. It requires confronting the emotional residue of old dependencies. There will be urges to delay, to ask for permission, to wait for a sign, but every time you move through that resistance, especially when paired with high attentional focus, you reinforce the agency circuits. You make it easier to act next time. You reduce the metabolic cost of discipline. You make autonomy feel familiar. Everything you do, from the words you choose to speak to the decisions you make under pressure, is driven not by the external environment, but by your internal state. This is not a philosophical idea. It's a neurobiological fact. The brain, body, and nervous system operate as one integrated system. And the internal conditions of that system, your physiological arousal, emotional baseline, mental focus, and chemical state, shape your perception of the world and your capacity to act within it. At the center of this process is your autonomic nervous system, which includes the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches. When you are in a high arousal sympathetic state, what we commonly call stress mode, your perception narrows, threat detection increases, and your actions become reactive. When you're in a parasympathetic state, rest and digest mode, you are more likely to engage in creative thinking, long-term planning, and open social connection. The same situation, whether it's a business challenge, a relationship conversation, or a physical goal, will produce vastly different actions depending on where your nervous system is operating. Your internal state is the filter through which the brain evaluates the outside world. If you're in a heightened fear or stress state, you don't just feel different, you see different. Literally. Your visual field constricts and your ability to perceive peripheral cues drops. And this isn't psychological weakness. It's an adaptive biological response designed to help you focus on threats. But in modern life, where threats are more psychological than physical, this narrowed lens can lead to poor decision-making, impulsivity, or avoidance. This is why training your state regulation is more important than constantly trying to control your environment. You can't always dictate what life throws at you, but you can train how your system responds. Tools like deliberate breath work, cold exposure, focused attention practices, and even physical movement can shift your neurochemical landscape within minutes. And when the internal chemistry changes, your perception of possibility changes with it. Take, for example, the role of dopamine, a molecule often misunderstood as simply a pleasure chemical. In reality, dopamine is more accurately a marker of motivation and forward movement. When your internal state is rich in dopamine, your brain interprets effort as worth it. Challenges become opportunities rather than threats. But when your internal state is depleted, low energy, high cortisol, scattered attention, action feels like friction, you begin to hesitate, to overthink, to avoid. Nothing in your external reality may have changed, but your state has, and with it, your behavior. Another major player is the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain responsible for executive function, planning, decision-making, and impulse control. The prefrontal cortex is highly sensitive to internal state. Under stress, blood flow to this region diminishes and control shifts to more primitive brain areas like the amygdala. This is why people often say things like, "I wasn't myself," or "I acted without thinking" under pressure. It's not a lack of willpower, it's a shift in neurological hierarchy. The good news is that this system is trainable. You can increase your ability to maintain cognitive control under pressure by practicing deliberate stress exposure while maintaining calm physiology. For instance, using controlled breathing during difficult workouts or high-stakes conversations teaches your nervous system that intensity is not danger. This wires resilience. It raises your threshold for dysregulation. Over time, you build a state where action flows not from panic, but from presence. Equally important is the role of internal dialogue. The words you say to yourself don't just reflect your state, they reinforce it. When you engage in internal language that promotes agency, capability, and clarity, you signal safety and competence to your system. This shifts hormonal cascades, regulates heart rate, and restores balance to the nervous system. You become a participant in shaping your own neurobiology moment by moment. Behavior follows state. You don't act with courage because you're naturally brave. You act with courage because your internal state is regulated enough to override fear signals. You don't make focused progress because distractions disappear. You make progress because your internal state allows for selective attention and cognitive clarity. The more you understand this link, the more you realize that external performance is an inside job. Even things like posture, eye position, and breathing pattern feed back into your state. Slouched posture, downward gaze, and shallow chest breathing all signal defeat to your nervous system. Upright posture, horizon-level gaze, and diaphragmatic breath tell your brain that you're in control. These are not superficial adjustments. They are levers that shift your internal environment and therefore your behavior in the external one. In almost every field, whether athletic, intellectual, or creative, there is a widely held assumption that talent determines the ceiling of your potential. But neuroscience, behavioral science, and performance psychology consistently show that while talent may give you a head start, it is consistency that determines where you ultimately land. Talent is an initial condition. Consistency is the system that sustains and compounds over time. At the level of brain circuitry, talent might mean that you have more efficient neural pathways in a specific domain. Maybe you process visual information faster, or you have an unusually sensitive auditory cortex. That's advantageous, but it's not determinative. Neural efficiency without reinforcement decays. What truly shapes long-term potential is neuroplastic reinforcement, and that only comes through repetition, engagement, and adaptation. Talent can spark progress, but only consistent action builds the architecture to support performance under pressure. Consistency is not just about discipline, it's about harnessing the way your brain learns. Each time you perform a task, whether it's lifting a weight, writing a paragraph, solving an equation, or regulating your emotions, specific neural circuits are activated. When you repeat those circuits, especially with focused attention, you strengthen the synaptic connections involved. The process is literal. Proteins are laid down, synapses are stabilized, and the circuits become more efficient. This is called long-term potentiation, and it's the cellular basis of learning. What this means is that a person with average talent but exceptional consistency will build a deeper, more stable neural infrastructure over time than someone with high talent and sporadic engagement. The consistent practitioner is reinforcing the right patterns day after day, making the execution smoother, faster, and more automatic. The talented but inconsistent performer may flash moments of brilliance, but their circuitry never stabilizes. They remain in a state of potential that's never fully actualized. Consistency also plays a critical role in shaping your identity, which feeds back into your behavior. Every time you show up, especially when it's difficult, you reinforce a sense of self that says, I am someone who does hard things. This is not a motivational slogan, it's a mechanism. The prefrontal cortex, which governs planning and action initiation, begins to anticipate success in difficult conditions when you repeatedly act in alignment with challenge. That expectancy reduces internal resistance. You stop debating whether to act and start assuming that you will. Dopamine, the neurochemical most associated with motivation and learning, also responds more reliably to effort than outcome. When you link dopamine release to the process itself rather than just the results, you create a self-reinforcing feedback loop. You start to crave the effort. You begin to associate growth with the act of showing up, not just with external validation. And this is where consistency becomes a competitive advantage. It trains your nervous system to derive reward from the process itself. Another reason consistency beats talent is because of how skills are layered. Human performance is rarely linear. It's the result of stacking multiple micro skills: timing, pattern recognition, emotional regulation, physical endurance, recovery, focus. Talent might give you one of those layers for free, but the others must be built. And the only way to build across layers is through repeated exposure, deliberate practice, and adaptation over time. Talent doesn't skip steps. Consistency climbs them. There's also the psychological adaptation to consider. When you train consistently, you encounter friction, boredom, setbacks, fatigue, failure. And each of these experiences builds what researchers refer to as emotional tolerance. You learn how to act without perfect conditions. You become less sensitive to internal noise. Over time, this makes you more durable, more reliable, and less reactive. That internal resilience becomes a multiplier for every skill you build on top of it. From a systems perspective, consistency creates predictable exposure to learning conditions. The brain thrives on predictability in training. Random bursts of effort provide novelty, but not stability. Neural circuits consolidate best when they are reactivated in regular patterns, spaced over time. This is the principle behind spaced repetition, a learning model rooted in